We can give this to Sandrine.
Okay, I'll be ready. Sound prompted.
Okay. So, is it Antonio? Oh, yeah, you're right.
Antonio.
Sorry. Okay.
Andrea. Okay, our next speaker is Professor Antonio Andreoni from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And please,
Thank you,
Antonio.
grazie. And thanks the organizer and thanks the editors in the Cambridge Table of Economics who still create space for this kind of important debates. Let me just, I will stay within the 15 minutes, I'll try to be brief and leave more details for discussion later on. But let me just try to spend at least 1 minute just to give you the context of this research, because this paper was really part of ongoing work that we've been doing, trying to understand digitalization and changes in business model in the context of digital platform and their impact for economies who are still trying to industrialize, to build their industrial capabilities. And in a sense, you will see the focus on, and some example from South Africa, really part of that kind of effort. Of course, this is not just relevant for low middle income countries and economies, but also is relevant for many of the European peripheries where companies are trying to engage with powerful digital platform and are trying to find a way to gain some competitive advantage in some of these areas. The second reason why we have been doing this work was because competition authorities are going through quite a lot of rethinking over the last few years. And this is an important moment where actually the traditional bifurcation between industrial policy on the side and competition policy on the other, always seen almost as opposites, are actually converging more and more. There has been an increasing, and we addressed that also in the paper, an increasing recognition that we have to rethink what competition is, what markets are, what are the boundaries, and perhaps we need to update competition policy to realize that the traditional horizontal dimensions or vertical dimensions are not sufficient to understand multi-sided digital platform. And finally, this work was really trying to set up a framework to engage with a number of cases across low middle income countries that we are looking at in order to understand exactly this link between platform and digital platform power and industrial capabilities, and ultimately trying to provide some suggestion on how competition industrial policy could better work together in order to address both the opportunities that digital platform offer in terms of breaking old forms of concentration, as well as creating new forms of concentration that might actually reduce entrance. And I think in this sense, we are very much in the Hollingheimer type of tradition in terms of understanding really these dynamics, now mediated not through simply transnational corporation, but effectively digital platform. Now, the key message of our paper, and this is not working out, oh, it's working out, can be summarized in these three main arguments. So the first one is that many low middle income countries are facing what we call a middle income technology trap. So and I'll explain what I mean exactly with that. But fundamentally, they are stuck in a situation where it's extremely difficult to engage with digital platform and digital technologies in general without ending up being in a very dependent and subordinate type of position. And digital platforms tend to increase the structural power asymmetries that we have always been observing in the case of global value chain and the relationship with transnational corporation. And in most cases, these are such asymmetries constrain market industry development in these countries. The second main argument that we make is that we have been discussing also today quite a lot about platform as if they are relatively homogeneous, but in fact they are extremely heterogeneous. And the way in which this heterogeneity plays out in terms of exercising power and constraining, reducing competition, I think needs to be better understood. The paper tried really to engage with this heterogeneity by providing a sort of framing of the different possibilities, taxonomies that we can use in order to understand, on the one hand, sources of power. I think resonates with what was discussed in the previous section as well, but also the capability that this platform provides, the functionalities that they have, and the core of their activities. And the argument here we are trying to make, again, which also links very nicely with the colleague from China who just gave the presentation, is that actually lots of this power is shaping power. It's not power in traditional terms of price markup, but in fact is a way, if you want, almost in a hegemonic power type of position, right? So shaping the way in which the industries, value chains, and markets are designed in the very first place. And the final point that we make is that actually governing this changed context of digital platform power, especially from a low middle income country perspective, is about really aligning competition policy and industrial policy, taking into account, we are talking about here optimal competition. Those who are familiar with the contribution of Ajit Singh and Alice Amsden, looking at the experience of Korea in the 90s when they were introducing this concept, you know what I'm referring to, is the idea that fundamentally you can accept some form of concentration provided that you can counterbalance them, right? So exploit lots of these opportunities that actually this digital platform provide in terms of, for example, giving access to companies to new markets and break domestic market concentration. Now, I could stop here because this is made argument, but let me show you keep going. At least I managed to convey the main argument of the paper. This is clearly not playing.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So why I said, you know, the middle income country provide a very interesting context. Well, there are several countries where a platform and digital platform are emerging. South Africa is probably one where we see a significant engagement with this digital platform. It's not working. And
Yeah.
I'm moving it. I'm moving it. I was waiting for you to realize it.
And when we see that there is a significant presence of digital platform across the most important sectors. So we work a lot, for example, in mining equipment, which is the core high-tech sector in the economy, where digital mines and digital technologies being deployed the most, as well as in the health sector, where South Africa is actually experimenting a number of digital platforms in the collection of data and the provision of this data to insurance company to segment the market and stratify the different type of risk and prices of that. So this is an interesting country to understand exactly this contradiction. On the one hand, the digital platforms are penetrating. On the other hand, they are breaking all forms of consolidation, all forms of concentration, especially in upstream sectors, but in other areas, they are creating new forms of monopoly capitalism. No, so what? Can you just go to the next one? Please. I'd say next. Okay, let's move. Yeah. Okay. So let me try, because time is running. So let me try to say what we mean here with this context. This is a context where we basically, the traditional challenge that companies are facing is what we call this challenge of breaking into, linking up while linking back, and keeping pace with technological change. So in the previous work with Kionat again, what we tried to identify were how these different steps in the engagement with global value chain and digital platform was basically made difficult by, on the one hand, increasing concentration in many industries, so the possibility to break into this industry globally. Secondly, the extent to which it was possible to link up into this value chain and value chain that are highly integrated into digital platform, because of course, the traditional distinction is no more holding, while at the same time we're capable to link back into the domestic economy. So for example, using capacity in predictive maintenance in a digital platform for a mining equipment company to reduce waste and increase efficiency, increase the quality of the product, and doing that while you are not able to control the digital platform, or your domestic systems for which you have technological capabilities are not interoperable with the global platform. So ultimately, you end up in situations where even if you are keeping pace with technological change, and this is a case of South Africa, this is a why I think is an interesting case. Even if you have technological capabilities, you are not allowed to capture value out of that because fundamentally the platform exercises that barrier into interoperable system. And we have seen this, we've done introducing the aerospace industry, in the mining equipment, in the automotive, and these things comes over and over again. Next slide, please. I'll skip this because I don't have time to go through it, but it's we try to articulate what that really means in practice in terms of building up technological capabilities at different stages of readiness of the technology. Now, this picture was already shown before, I think. This is the traditional way in which we keep looking at this variety of digital platform. And the first point that I made is, this is again a very efficiency contradiction type of point of view. Lots of these digital platforms in countries like South Africa, where concentration has been traditionally very, very strong in many value chains, actually they played an important role in breaking consolidated position and creating new routes to markets. So you have this double dynamic going on. On one end, as I was saying, at the global level, extraction of lots of value from domestic capabilities. On the other end, also new routes to the market. Next slide. So the problem when we try to look at all this diversity of cases, we realize that fundamentally we are challenged by the fact that we don't know what are the mechanisms that are used by each of these different type of digital platform in exercising their power. In some cases, they use old tricks that were always used in any shape or form in capitalism, in terms of pricing, in terms of access to market, in terms of what was discussed also before. But we are also seeing that new things are emerging. And the question is how these are balancing out on the other end, the increasing capabilities this platform offer to companies who want to engage with the global economy. In the paper, we mainly distinguish these three types of digital platform, and this is not to say that this is the only way to cut the cake or to analytically distinguish different type of platform. We distinguish between marketplace and exchange type of platform vis-a-vis those that are more search and social networking platform, and those that operate more into the B2B space, which are basically operating systems and software applications. Now, for each of them, what we suggest we need to do, I'll get there, is to look at, on the one hand, what functionalities this platform provide and what enabling capabilities they provide to access to markets. So we try to understand, as I gave the example before, the fact that you have a new system that make your mine digitally enabled or enhanced, how that changed the bottom line, how that changed the application of digital technologies along different stages of that chain. Or in the case of discovery vitality, for which we are doing another paper, how the fact that you have a company which is collecting data from watches in the middle class in South Africa is actually creating an enormous concentration in the insurance industry, where this company controls 57% of the sector, and match that power with hospitals, which are actually private as well, who are actually part of the same chain of what technically is called platform development, right? Use of the same data to move across different segments of the same industry or different industry. Next slide. Of course, understanding one side of the story, understanding what capability, what functions are operating, it's just one of the side of the other coin, which is what power this capability and function provide to this platform. So the way in which we try to frame this relationship, it's really to have on one side an analysis of platform function, on the other end an analysis of what are the sources of power. And you can see that the sources of power there are not the traditional Schumpeterian innovation type of idea, but also those that are more related to monopoly power, but also political rents position. And this is very much Heimer type of idea, that fundamentally you are transnational corporation who shape and control and exercise influence in that context in many middle-income countries. And I think resonates with what Chris was mentioned also before. Now, in this space, the main issue that we try to focus our attention on is what we call in the paper the anatomy of power, or digital platform power, which actually goes through all these different steps. Of course, traditional idea of excluding rivals, platform development, what I just described, the idea that you use data actually to move across different segments. So suddenly a competition authority doesn't know what is the relevant market because your data is operating across several markets at the same time. The capacity to make the news and shape up platform architecture. I mean, what is striking for me is that many of these platforms have lots of open access attached to them. It's not that everything is closed, but how they balance out what is open and what is closed, it's really that shaping of the way in which different actors are locked into software solution or data solution, and so on and so forth. Now, next slide. And I close with this one, perfect. Now, how do we engage with the situations where you have, as you can see again, the same triangle of platform function and platform power? The link between the two is the economies of scale and scape, the scale and scope, the network effect, and so on. And of course, at the core of that relationship, there is data, which provides this kind of platform the possibility to exercise this function and extract value through their power. So our argument is that we need to think about two sides of industrial and competition policy. On the one hand, competition policy needs to engage with these dimensions of power. On the other hand, industrial policy needs to increase the capability of firms to engage. For example, once you have made a legislation that made system interoperable, you need to have companies who are able to create their own software, their own data analytics to engage with the global platform in that space. So you cannot just regulate the market and try to restrict competition. You need to also do capacity or capability enhancing type of initiative on the other end. And also what we argue is that if you think about competition policy in a dynamic capability sense, of course, you can, over time, accept some element of concentration, provided that concentration is functional to scale up and increase capabilities across a number of firms who are in these countries trying to engage with the early stages of medium high-tech industrialization, and they're trying to escape the type of middle-income technology trap. And I think here the debate really goes back to the core, and I'll really finish there, of that discussion that scholars like Alice Hamston and Ajit Singh were making in the context of fast industrialization in East Asia, where in fact industrial policy was always the main framework within which also competition policy was operating. Meaning the idea was you have an industrial policy framework and you use competition, restraint of competition or increasing competition at different level of the markets, including the export market, right? So that management of competition in a strategic way, it's really what makes competition policy part of an industrial policy. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, our next speaker is Sandrine Labori.
Yeah.
Questo.
Quello non so se, let me see.
From the University of Ferrara, and she will talk about industrial strategy in a transforming capitalism.
This doesn't work, right?
No, but I'll give you the mouse in 1 sec.
Mouse, okay.
Yeah.
So
You want to come here?
No, but I can give this to her.
I do it. Okay. Thank you
Like
very
this.
much. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to the organizers and to the editors of the special issue, which allowed us, myself and Patrizio Bianchi, who is not here today, but say hello to everybody who knows in the room. Unfortunately, we could not be there. So our contribution is called Industrial Strategy in the Transforming Capitalism. I've added here insights from Keith Cowling, because what we did was looking at the characteristics of digital platforms, their high market power, the evolution of industry and their impact on all the productive sectors. What does Keith Cowling's writings provide us as insights, especially regarding industrial policy, so policy aimed at orientating structural changes and industrial development. So my outline here, I will make it very simple. First, superpowers and increasing concentration of industry. I will go very quickly over this because other speakers today mentioned and stressed the increasing concentration in industries, not only the market power of big techs, but also in all industries. This is observed and shown. Monopolization and big techs, and then industrial strategy promoting diffuse governance structures as a possible way, avenue of looking at how to control the big power of these superstars. So sorry, I put this picture, which is quite childish, but I used it for a presentation to my students. And okay, we have superpowers, the GAFAM, also Chinese big digital platforms are very, very big. Just to figure the sum of Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple revenue in 2021 was $1,200 billion. The first 4 European firms in terms of revenue in that year was about $800 billion, much less. And the only thing I want to stress here is that the companies, the European companies, were Volkswagen, BP, Shell, Daimler, which are, and you can observe here the impact of the industrial revolution that is ongoing. Now big digital platforms, which are the new companies of the new era, have all the power, and the European firms are still in the old sectors, automobile and oil sector. So they're losing revenue and market power. GAFAM have huge market capitalization, which give them deep pockets, and this deep pocket theory that allow them to make huge investment, and especially in terms of excess capacity in the sense of kit cowling, it allows them to make huge investments and avoid entry. Big market power. Okay, I said I would go fast in that, and so big tech have huge market power, huge and market capitalization. So there are big firms showing concentration, but this also happens in other sectors, and superstar companies are in various sectors. And there is this data by McKinsey in 2018 showing that there are about 6,000 firms in the world with more than $1 billion of revenue. And McKinsey estimated that they represent 2/3 of the total revenue of firms in the world, according to them. So something like 0.0028% of world companies make 2/3 of the total revenue. So that's really superstars. So not only concentration increases, but also industrial dynamics seems to reduce, because there are studies on the rate of startup creation in different sectors that show that it is reducing over the last years. So monopolization, this is evidence of monopolization. Keith Cowling, of course, and we've stressed that the whole day, shown straight that monopolization is an inevitable tendency of market economies. So in his words, capitalism is characterized by the dominance of oligopolies with unassailable dominant positions. The degree of monopoly is determined by concentration and the degree of pollution, as well as the elasticity of demand, without his word, which the large companies can influence through advertising. And together with Phil, who presented today, we have a number of papers which are very, very interesting, and also stress this problem of tendency of monopolization of the industry. The long-run aim of firms is the effective monopolization of strategic industries. Deconcentration will not be favored by the dominant, who will seek to suppress such development either through mergers, strategic alliances, or anti-competitive behavior. So big techs implement monopolization strategies, excess capacity, predation, and preemption. I suppose I don't have much time, so I will go quickly. Of course, there is also this element besides the strategy implemented of their main business based on big data and big data collection and analysis. With big data infrastructures often considered as essential facilities. There are market intermediaries, these big techs, which all firms in all sectors have to deal with. Okay, so in many respects, they are becoming essential facilities. So the trades also barriers to entry. So what to do with that? Yes, Antonio stressed sort of complementarity between industrial strategy or industrial policy and competition policy. We also think this is the way. Keep Cowling stressed relentlessly stressed in his writings, also studies together with Phil, that inclusive and democratic development should be favored. And he stressed, in particular, looking at some real cases like industrial districts, as I think Christoph stressed this morning, that favoring alternative governance structures and diffused governance structures could be a way to favor pro-competitive dynamics. So in the paper we focus on that, looking at governance structures and acting on the governance of these markets in order to favor more democratic reduction of their so huge market power and also political power. Governance, influencing governance means an ex-ante action in these markets. So Competition Policy Act ex post. Its timing is very long, so it's very often the action or the measure comes too late. So ex-ante regulation is ex-ante. It should be appropriate for inducing pro-competitive behavior. And there are two cases in the world, I think, about of regulation of digital markets. One is the EU last year adopting the Digital Market Act, as well as Digital Service Act, and the other is China. China, what's her name, Zhong Yin, mentioned the case of China. China has chosen the direct intervention, strong command and control to induce an evolution of these markets according to pro-competitive behavior, also behavior which is in line with the national interests. The EU has adopted that ex-ante regulation with the Digital Market Act. So it identifies digital gatekeepers, big platforms, and commits to check their behavior and imposes them to act in a fair and contestable way, so pro-competitive way. Yeah, I will be very quick. So China, the action of China is towards this market is really command and control and very strong. It even has adopted a law, an algorithm. So it's really controlling the activities of these digital platforms very much detail, looking at the core, which is algorithm, right? Algorithm must not be discriminatory, must be pro-competitive and conforming to the interests of the nation. China has also a state administration of market regulation created in 2018 and the cyberspace administration of China, which monitors the digital sector actually is also, that's interesting, and I think Dan Jing also showed the shareholding not mixing up, but in trade show, the word doesn't come between big platforms and smaller platforms. There is also, of course, presence of the government in terms of shareholding, and the cyberspace administration of China is the majority owner of China Internet Investment Fund, and this China Internet Investment Fund has golden shares in firms such as ByteDance or Weibo, which are in this sector. So besides this ex-ante regulation trying to involve, to induce an evolution of the sector that could be pro-competitive, with all the difficulties that the implementation of the DMA, the Digital Market Act, will have, perhaps promoting alternative governance structures would also be useful. There are cooperative platforms that have been created. They are not the panacea, they are not the ultimate solution, but promoting the development of cooperative platforms could be an idea to favor democratic development, right? Association of users, like the Gaia X project concerning the cloud. And open data infrastructures at local and regional level have also appeared, like in Barcelona, favoring open data, open data infrastructures, and well, very briefly, allowing not to rely too much on these digital platforms, which are essentially from the US. Yes, I'm closing. So we discussed that in the paper. Okay. So concentration of industry and increase in market power is happening in general. We think that useful insights of Keith Cowley in this regard is regards governance structure, and promoting the diffused governance structure is an interesting point that Cowley and Tomlinson raised in their papers. Just to finish, just a small advertising about this wonderful handbook of industrial development that Phil and I and Patrizio just published in January 2023. We have dedicated it to Keith Cowley, so we are very happy about that. Thank you for
well, our next speaker is Professor David Bailey from the University of Birmingham, and he will talk about Brexit and industrial policy in the UK.
Thank you all very much. Firstly, a very big thank you to the organizer. I think it's been a wonderful day. Every paper has been interesting. It's been one of the most interesting workshops I've been to in years. So a very big thank you. A mea culpa, Phil presented my paper with him earlier. So what I'm talking about isn't about big tech. So it doesn't really fit, but I was really keen to come, so they squeezed me in. And we thought we'd talk to you a bit about Brexit and what's going on in the UK, and partly try and reflect on, well, what would Keith make of all this? I mean, it's just totally bizarre what's happening. I'm very conscious that I'm between you and a pedicidi, so I'll be as quickly as possible. But one other advert is that there will be a special issue of Regional Studies. I'm an editor of that, along with Phil Tomlinson, on digital platforms. and the call for papers will come out soon. So people look out for it, and maybe I could distribute it through the network. So then I just want to go through some of the things that have been happening in the UK in terms of Brexit, the impacts of that, and learning some of the right lessons from that. And in particular, come right back to what Malcolm was saying this morning about the need for an industrial strategy. We do not have one in the UK. Pete, along with Malcolm and Christos, for many years, kept alive the notion of an industrial policy in the UK when we went through Thatcherism and all sorts of other things. They kept that idea going against the orthodoxy. The fact that we can still discuss it, I think, is largely down to them. I'll skip through this, but essentially the UK is going through stagflation. So high inflation, zero growth. We had an utter economic fiasco last year with the Prime Minister Liz Truss, which blew up and the markets took fright. We've now got a new Chancellor who is increasing taxes and cutting expenditure at a time when the economy is either in recession or flatline, so pro-cyclical policy. At the same time, that's not working here. At the same time, we've got about up to 1 million missing workers from the economy, partly to do with COVID. Over 50s decided to stay at home because they didn't want to re-engage in the market, partly because of Brexit. So a large number of EU workers went home and didn't bother coming back again, and who can blame them? We also have some particular problems in the UK as a result of years and years of privatisation policies. So the fact that the energy crisis in the UK is so great is largely down to a privatised system whereby fuel companies can massively increase prices. That is not the case in much of Europe, where it's either been regulated or stay home. So we're suffering from some of the problems of an excessive reliance on so-called markets. Next slide. This is simply a diagram showing what's expected in the UK in terms of a very long, shallow recession. At best, the UK is flatlining. We're seeing high inflation and no growth. Globally, we're entering a perilous phase, as the IMF calls it. Global growth forecasted to slow considerably, probably 1 in 4 chance of risk of global recession. That's the lowest, sort of weakest growth profile since the beginning of the century. And the IMF itself stresses the need for multilateral cooperation. Again, something that Keith talked about repeatedly in tackling some of the global issues that we face. We heard a lot about China today. One of the big things as well is that China is slowing. Its ability to deliver growth for the global economy is slowing. It's been the main driver of growth globally for a long time now. Yeah. That trend rate of growth will slow, partly because of the one-child policy, partly because of stagnation in the property market, partly because local government no longer has money to spend on infrastructure. So we cannot rely on China for growth to pull us along. We have to find growth ourselves. US likely to face all sorts of problems this year as well in terms of the debt ceiling approaching, real risk of recession in the US and the EU. One of the real issues coming out of this is a possible hit to a permanent hit to economic capacity. Again, something Keith talked about in the UK in the 1980s, where excessively tight monetary policy combined with the overshooting of the exchange rate destroyed a third of the manufacturing base. The UK has never recovered from that. It's never recovered from that in terms of regional performance, in inequality, or in its ability to raise productivity growth, because we effectively wasted too much of the manufacturing base. Now, Brexit, that's a long queue of lorries trying to get to Dover and onwards. All sorts of effects of Brexit on the manufacturing base and the economy, huge issues about being outside the customs union, British business paying something like £15 billion a year just in filling out customs declarations, just complying with rules of origin rules, another 7 billion. Huge delays at borders and trading costs, which means that operating just-in-time production systems becomes virtually impossible, and you have to stockpile huge numbers of parts. That all means higher prices in the UK, and it has contributed to higher inflation in the UK than in other countries. Issues around workforce and skills, about access to research and development funding. One of the arguments for Brexit, interestingly, was an argument that the EU constrained the ability of the UK to give state aid to its industry. And one argument was, if we could be outside the EU, we could do more in terms of industrial policy. What have we done with that extra freedom? Absolutely nothing. We have scrapped industrial policy, and we're standing on the sidelines as the US the EU and China all pursue really quite aggressive industrial policies, and we're standing watching. So, impact of Brexit in the long run is going to be greater than the impact of COVID on the UK economy. We have a vaccine for COVID. We do not have a vaccine for Brexit, sadly. In terms of the hits, in terms of what this could mean, where we ended up with was a free trade agreement, quite narrowly defined with the EU. Best guess estimate is that by 2030, that will mean a hit to GDP of around 6.7% compared with what it would have been if we'd stayed in. Next slide. And that's no surprise because most of our trade is with the EU. It's very bizarre, isn't it, to put up trade barriers with the biggest single market on your doorstep to then say, oh, we can do a trade deal with Australia. That is not going to compensate for the hit to trade. Next slide. And so if you look at Britain's economic performance since the referendum, effectively, we've slowed. So that was the referendum. Since the referendum, there was an immediate slowing in economic growth, even before the trade situation kicked in, because of the uncertainty deterring investment. So you saw a slowing in economic growth straight after the referendum, the COVID hit, and we've not recovered as quickly as other countries. Next slide, please. One way to estimate that is to look at what's called the doppelganger model, where you construct a kind of a model of the economy and look at how it would have performed in the absence of Brexit. And this has been done by John Springford. When he's done this, he thinks already the impact from Brexit using this approach is about 5% of GDP, significantly higher than government estimates. So GDP growth moved to a lower trajectory post Brexit. You can see it against the doppelganger estimates of where we should be. Next slide. And there's also a huge issue which Keith talked about at detail. Which is our productivity problem. We have a poor track record on productivity performance in the UK anyway, for all sorts of reasons. They go back to our underlying weaknesses as an economy: low investment, poor skill, short-termism, the openness to takeovers, which focuses companies on short-term profit. Again, something that Keith talked about in detail. So we've got these long-run fundamental issues. Brexit hasn't helped those, it's actually added to them even further because of these post-Brexit trading rules deterring exports and imports, which are down by about 15%, and it's often the most productive firms that engage in trade, and they've been hit the most. So these productivity effects from Brexit are feeding through more quickly than anticipated. Another point, which is made by the Financial Times, hardly the bastion of socialist thinking, which has said that in the UK, we've made a societal choice. I don't think we have. I think it's a political choice by government to not prioritise manufacturing. We've allowed too much manufacturing to disappear. Manufacturing is still important. A lot of services depend on it, and it drives productivity growth. You neglect that at your peril, and we're seeing the consequences of that today in the UK. So, other effects of Brexit: a massive hit to investment, something like 35% below where it would have been potentially in the if you compare it to the pre-referendum trend. Less investment means less capital stock. It's a long-run productivity problem. Keep going. Our exchange rate depreciated markedly post-Brexit. You would think that that would boost exports because it makes our exports more competitive. Part of the problem, though, is that there's a follow-through effect because so many imports that come into the UK and components are put into things like cars or aeroplane wings and then exported. We actually imported a whole load of inflation, so we didn't get that usual macroeconomic boost that's expected. Again. And because of that, not surprisingly, UK exports have stagnated. So they're way beyond other countries, keep going, in terms of where we might be, and we're underperforming the rest of the world. There's a debate within the UK about whether imports or exports have been affected most, but roughly about 15% impact on trade, keep going, which means as well, over time, our trade deficit is increasing. Skip that. Of course, Boris Johnson had hoped we'd get a trade deal with the US. That hasn't happened. And in fact, as Obama once said, get to the back of the queue. So actually, the US is interested in big deals with big trade blocks. The EU and China. That ain't the UK. Keep going. So there we go, just to show that. Keep going. And essentially what we have done in the UK are so-called rollover deals with other countries, places like Australia, New Zealand. The New Zealand deal, as far as I know, will add 0.01 or 0.03% to GDP. It ain't going to compensate for loss of trade with Brexit. There was a deal done on there with Japan, which was a rollover deal that the EU had. The UK had to do that. Liz Truss really boasted about that because it opened up the cheese market. Now, I've worked in Japan. Many Japanese people are lactose intolerant and they don't eat cheese. And in fact, the value of cheese exports to Japan in 2019 was about £100,000, the value of one Range Rover. So that isn't going to boost the economy either. Keep going. Then there may be some long run. I'm trying to be as neutral as possible. There may be some long run benefits from Brexit in terms of maybe being able to build our own regulations better suited to the UK, or maybe think about regulation in new areas. But they're quite uncertain and they're long term. The costs are apparent, they're significant, and they're immediate. Next slide. Skip this one. Right, okay. Heath kept alive the idea of industrial policy for a long time. And this is very much back on the agenda around the world. Phil and I have just done a nice conversation piece on this. If you look at the Conversation UK, we've done a blog about it. Biden has introduced the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Science Act, over $400 billion supporting green manufacturing, embracing new technology, reshoring supply chains, and reducing reliance on China. That has been a game changer. Since that was introduced last summer, there's been $80 billion of investment into green technologies in the US. As a result of that, the EU has revisited its state aid rules, and it said we can relax those, and it's introduced the outlines of a Green Deal industrial plan, focusing on funding, regulation, skills, and resilient supply chains. We have yet to see the detail of that. That is yet to come, but the EU is going for industrial policy big time as well. China has been doing this for a long time anyway. What's happened in the UK? Well, under Boris Johnson, industrial policy has sadly been scrapped, as Malcolm was alluding to. There was a whole load of effort that went into developing industrial policy under the back end of the last Labour government, the coalition government, under the Theresa May government. It was a very limited policy, but it was useful. And what was important about it was a dialogue, a participatory approach between government and business to identify opportunities and challenges and then develop appropriate policies. So it's very much that Danny Roderick kind of approach to actually participatory discovery of tacit knowledge. That went, okay, that was scrapped. We have no industrial policy whatsoever in the UK, despite all of these supposed Brexit freedoms. Not having a strong manufacturing base is denting our productivity growth. There's a big sort of campaign to get industrial strategy back onto the agenda. But it's a great shame, I think, that given all of the work that Keith did and Christoph did and many others in keeping this on the agenda, it was thrown out of the window in the UK. We have a lot of work to do as academics to try and get it back on the agenda in the UK, so the UK can do some of the things that we're seeing in the US, in the EU, and in China. One final thing, we're facing at least two massive challenges. One is the challenge of net zero. The other one is of Industry 4.0. And as a lot of those new technologies come in, if we stymie ourselves in the UK post-Brexit, we're going to lose out on investment in both of them. Thank you very much. Yeah.
We are now having an intervention from Andrea Coveri, who will comment on all the papers, and then there will be some questions from the floor.
Can you hear me? Yes, great. Well, thank you very much, Gratis, for giving me the word. I would like to thank you all our panelists, and in particular Dario Guarati for the organization of the World Advanced, and in particular of this wonderful international workshop of today, together with, Elena, Nicolò, and some of the guys and girls. I do not remember the name exactly in this moment, but well, I'm really thankful. Okay, I'm going to try to say provide you with some points, some comments, some questions related to more or less all the presentations, very, very insightful presentations that we have heard just now. I will start with a presentation provided by Professor John Lee, okay, on the monopolization and the connection between monopolization and financialization. How much time do I have, more or less?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. Well, I have 2 or 3 points that I would like to raise, and I hope that some discussion will follow on this. But I think that's an interesting thing that has already also discussed this morning and yesterday afternoon is this fact according to which big tech, let's say large digital platforms, report very low profits and even lower distributed dividends. Okay, and this is rather startling. I remember that also Mario mentioned this today and or yesterday. And at the same time, we know that this is largely due to the very great amount of investment in research and development activities and in intangible assets in general that these kind of corporations perform, especially Amazon, Facebook, and Google, as it has been discussed this morning. Now, my question is first, how would you explain this? Because I think that yet we didn't find a proper explanation of this kind of dynamics. And if you want a correlated question is what about Alibaba and Tencent? Because I have seen the data, especially with regard to the big tech from the, let's say, based on the US, but I didn't look very deeply in the data of Alibaba and Tencent. So I wonder whether, let's say, the dynamics of profits and especially of the distributed dividends is more or less the same. Now, let me advance a couple of explanations. Okay, a first explanation that has been proposed by a Marxist economist, let's say, that used to work in the financial sector, which is, let's say, known as Michael Roberts, even if it is not the real name of the guy, to be honest. Well, one explanation which is provided that, let's say, trying to shedding light on the contradiction of capitalist accumulation by digital platforms in particular. Potential explanation is the following. Well, that these dynamics might be related to the higher pace, the higher rate of depreciation of intangible assets, essentially. In the moment in which softwares, databases, brands, and so on can be replicated more easily, yes, according to the intellectual property regime that holds, okay, but in the moment in which, let's say, the pace of the depreciation of the, let's say, constant capital in Marxian terms, or the constant digital capital, or intangible capital, is higher, okay, the depreciation of digital capital is higher, occurs at a higher rate compared to the standard, let's say, tangible capital. Well, it might be, let's say, harder for this kind of platforms to protect their profits. And at the same time, and even more so, it is harder for them to distribute dividends because they have to reinvest a lot of resources in R&D activities because, let's say, the custom capitals on which their business relies on might be affected by the higher rate of depreciation. This is an explanation that I found not totally, let's say, unfounded. And then there is another point that I would like to raise on this. That is, if you want an opposite thesis. That is the following, that substantially the big tech corporate business model represents the end of the so-called shareholder value orientation, okay, or the so-called short-termism orientation of investors, okay, because as I said, let's say because of the very low level of distributed dividends for investors. Well, let me add something also about this. As has been recalled this morning, if I'm not wrong, by Chris Pitelis, well, probably these stages might encounter some problems due to the fact that, yes, it is true that the level of the distributed dividends is very, very low, but at the same time, it's true that the investors can gain very, very large capital gains due to the very large gains in terms of capital gains, okay, due to the growing price of their shares on the financial market. So from this point of view, we are still in a paradigm that is the typical paradigm of the neoliberalism, let's say, of the last 40 years, that is one that is not in contradiction with a shareholder value orientation. Now, let me move to the again, very, very interesting and insightful presentation by Antonio Andreoni. Well, a couple of things. The first thing is that this presentation recalled to my mind a paper by Cedric Durand and William Milber published in the Review of International Political Economy more or less 10 years ago. That's a paper in which the authors try to disentangle the drivers of the monopoly power due to the role of intangible assets in global value chains. Global value chains and intangible assets in global value chains in particular that are controlled by, say, so-called lead firms in order to capture a larger share of value produced by the actors involved in global value chains. Well, my point is this one. Given that in your paper that I really enjoyed to read, talk about, let's say, an entrepreneurial regulatory state, that if you want, as you put it, it is let's say an updated form of industrial policy for the era of the big tech, right? Well, my point is this one. If I'm not wrong, okay, if I didn't understand you wrong, well, substantially this industrial policy is still an industrial policy at the state level. But at the same time, we put a lot of attention, okay, and I think that is much important to do this on the, let's say, transnational nature of technological global value chains and of the global value chains in particular that are orchestrated by digital platforms. So my point is that how we can, or what are the challenges that are posed to a state level industrial policy of the kind that you suggest in a context in which data flows cross borders and concentrated in those places in which they have the infrastructure to manage them, as is the treatment, if you want, of poorer economies and regions. I would like to add something about China because, okay. Okay, very quickly, if you want, it is a provocative question. If you want. Do you think that China can be regarded as a country that promoted an industrial policy of the kind that you advise? I'm talking about in this moment, you know, to the stop of the IPO by Alibaba, promoted by Alibaba by the Chinese government. Okay, and to the strict report that has been recalled also in the very last presentations that the Chinese government trying to maintain in order to develop a stronger digital sector to counterbalance the power of the big techs from the US. So, and I will speak on South Africa, but I just a couple of words, and I want to move to the again. Really interesting presentation by Sandrine Laborie. A presentation that I appreciated because tries to, again, to update an industrial policy framework for the age of the big techs. stressing the role of regulation that is performed ex ante and not, let's say, in the more downstream phases of, let's say, final markets in which still digital platforms play a role. However, let me provide again another, if you want, a little provocative thought. That is the following: why can we not imagine? Why not imagining, let's say, data and digital infrastructures as global public goods? I do not know whether this point has been already raised in these days, but it is a point that I think that should be stressed for the following reason. On the one side, we know that the data and the technology controlled by big tech, because of their very nature, give rise to monopoly power and to monopoly rents due to network externalities, due to economies of scale on the supply and on the demand side of the market, and all these leads to a pattern of uneven value capture opportunity. Okay, but at the same time, on the other side, we also know that the big tech capabilities, the amount of dynamic capabilities that big tech have accumulated, especially in the last, let's say, 15 years, okay, capabilities to centralize data and plan production gave rise to incredible efficiency gains that we all enjoy in the moment in which we use our smartphone. Just for make an example. So what's the problem according to me? Well, the problem is that these incredible efficiency gains are privately owned, are privately gained. So in a contribution, maybe then I should stop a couple of words. Well, in a contribution that we brought, that I wrote with Dario Guarascio and Claudio Cozza, that presented a paper of ours this morning, we wrote something like this, that according to us, the power of big tech can be challenged, provided one is willing to go beyond conventional antitrust policies and privacy protection. The latter do not call into question the privatization of digital information, which could even be exacerbated by stronger privacy protection rules. And this is a point in which we take a distance, let's say, from, in a way, from this point of view, from the work of Shoshana Zuboff. Even less, these kind of policies put into call the profit-oriented use of data and digital infrastructure. So let's say we try to send this kind of message, a progressive strategy aiming for economic and political democracy should strive towards the decommodification of personal data through 1 minute.
1 minute.
Through 1 minute, yes. Through socialization of data and platform infrastructures. In this respect, the big tech's capability to coordinate the actors in its network or in their network and efficiently plan the production and the distribution of goods and services, thanks to the growing harnessing of data, provides us with a glimpse of the shared social benefits which could derive from a radical reorientation of their infrastructure towards the public good. So I would like to have some thoughts on this. And let me close with a question to David. Okay, and the question is this one is, let's say, related to Brexit, maybe. Okay, while we were talking at a certain point, I thought, well, but do you think? Let's say, I'm curious about your opinion. Do you think that UK, let's say, is going to lose also its role of global financial center, especially London, well, due to Brexit? Or on in the medium to long term? Or do you think, on the contrary, that it will consolidate, or it might be consolidated even more, that kind of very unequal model of development based on inward financial flows and connected capital gains, drawing out even more resources from other manufacturing sectors like the automotive one, and I put here. Thank you very much.
Okay, shall we take a few questions from the floor? Are there questions, Mario?
Be brief.
Excellent discussion on the new forms monopoly power is taking. With this China, very interesting, middle income countries, very interesting, and British decline that is, was more well known. 2 points. It is interesting to be aware of how inadequate our usual numbers, our usual indicators are. Digital platforms don't do foreign direct investment, as was said yesterday. So, because they are producing material goods, so they don't make profits and they don't give dividends, because the logic of capital accumulation there is through the concentration of capital assets. But they do a lot of mergers in acquisition. This is the first point. The policy implications are even more stark, because we have not the old framework which Sandrine has been trying to update. Doesn't capture very fundamental novelties. And here I think we have to quote Shoshana Zuboff for 2 reasons. One, she says that, well, not just her, Polanyi, where the boundaries between commodities and not commodities. So this is something very important. Digital platforms change radically, extending the boundaries of commodity production and the personal lives and data are important. And this is without precedent in the context of industrial capitalism. Secondly, Zuboff argues that the ability to target users and shape demand completely cancels the Keynesian and post-Keynesian approach to uncertainty about demand. They don't have any uncertainty about demand because they create exactly the targeted demand that they answer with a specific supply. So there is no problem at all of underconsumption in the Keynesian way. There is a problem of the ability of this type of supply to create their own specific type of demand, which is highly asymmetric, highly unjust in its distribution and so on. If we look at the trade-off between competition and industrial policy in this perspective is completely irrelevant, because of much bigger questions are at stake. In these days, we are running after ChatGPT and artificial intelligence stories, addressing them from the silliest point, the authority in Italy, the authority on privacy. So no one is shaping the market for these things at the European or Italian level or American level. And basically, the choice is whether we will use ChatGPT or the Google alternative or the Amazon alternative. So we leave completely the choices of technologies and the nature of economic activities to them. It is not another difference from the old industrial policy European level. As in manufacturing in the old times, Europe had their own actors. In this case, as you Washington, we are talking about regulating something in industrial policy without permits.
Yes.
And so what are the goals in this respect? So this is a much more radical type of story. So I think in this case, clearly, Elizabeth Warren's proposal of breaking demand was an interesting starting point, at least it's too late now. But the question is really preventing further merger acquisition or breaking up. And in this case, clearly, China seems we don't know enough about China, but seems a sensible industrial policy role. Thank you.
Okay, Christos.
I also have 11
Can you?
Yeah.
Go what he was saying.
I had 11 questions, but I will ask it well. This is today. I was asked to write an article about trust, and I made myself very unpopular by actually being in favor. What I don't understand is why Keynesians, who all the time were talking about trust-like policies, trusted policies. Because what's the deal? Obsolete to say that forget austerity, let's have expansionary policy. In my article, I said that's in the right direction. It should also be complemented with supply side expansionary policies. It doesn't do this, but at least it's a first step. It's a first good step in the same direction. Then everybody talks about the disastrous trust policy. They got rid of him. And my worry as a left winger is it because it was so destructive or is it because it questioned the Washington consensus, like the Syriza tried the left-wing parties and ended up having a right-wing government being trusted by the establishment for having left-wing policy.
When Dario has a question.
Yeah, no, this is just a curiosity to David. Since we talked a lot about power and about the asymmetric distribution of power, if you like, we didn't talk about this, but there is an issue of interest groups capable to shape policies and to push decisions. So my point is, out of what you have shown concerning Brexit, who are those who gained? Who are those gaining now? Which kind of power reshaping is taking place? And to what extent this is also related to the global reshaping that we are observing, also related to the US-Europe relationship? Just thinking at the war that is going on, and to a certain extent, how much this war is also a next level in the EU-US relationship. So I believe that the economic figures that you have shown, but it is interesting also in perspective terms how this can.
Antonello.
I have basically three comments I would like to submit. The first one is that we are actually emphasizing very much the issue of platforms as a sort of substitution of tangible economics or substitute or transition from the traditional transnational corporation. And this is something that doesn't convince me fully. I think there's a coexistence of the two phenomena, which is going to be a long run coexistence, and probably something that is, I would say, complementary in a way. For instance, the fact that we are talking about issues of digital technologies enabling the development of platforms implies that we probably disregard the importance of basic knowledge, for instance, which requires proximity much more than the distribution and the diffusion of codified knowledge. So I would say this has to be dealt with. The second issue is that when we talk about profits declining or not very high in the case of platform companies, and also observe that platform companies do a lot of mergers and acquisition. I think this has to do, this is part of the explanation. From textbook economics, I would say that mergers and acquisition tend to be accompanied by lower profits, at least in the short run. And this is something that might have to do with the precise moment we are living, which is a transition towards platform economics. Third and final, we shouldn't overemphasize the dramatic power of these organizations. I would say that even the old Kenneth Arrow has taught to us that there are limits to the organization and the capabilities of governing. The whole knowledge flows that can be generated and knowledge learning opportunities. So probably there are monopoly positions and monopoly power capabilities, but at the same time, there's a lot of things that are actually escaping from their control. Thanks.
Okay. I want to add one small point which refers to Antonio, in fact, and which is linked to what Antonello's just said. And it is the issue about the heterogeneity of platforms. This is an issue which in a different form has come up yesterday as well, when Alessandro was talking about taxonomy and there was a discussion about it. The problem at the moment is that we are in a transitional period in which we tend to classify companies by the new technology they use, by are they digitalized or are they not digitalized. But those very companies have many other characteristics. The type of function they do or product they produce, but I would also like to stress that the production processes may be different in spite of all of them using digital technologies. And the last one, which we tend to forget, is the fact that the organization of the production process may be different. What I mean is that some may go the route towards externalization, others towards internalization, and this makes a big difference to the way the company is shaped and makes a big difference to the relationship with the workforce or to the relationship within the market and so on. Now, would you like to reply to the various questions? Shall we ask Jean if she has any, or maybe
Yeah, sure. I think that
Antonio could start.
okay. So we should either ask Jean to start or to talk as the last one.
Well, we don't know whether she's ready.
I think she's just
Oh,
there.
are you there?
Would you like to say something, Jean?
Yes. Okay.
So
yes.
Ray, go ahead.
Okay, I'll be brief. Thank you for all the comments and the questions. I want to say first is, yes, I do think intangible makes a difference, and there has been strong empirical evidence to show that industries with higher intangible asset ratios have lower investment to profit ratios. So we are seeing probably a delinking between investment and profitability, particularly in industries or companies with high intangibles. And that raises another concern, I think, for the macroeconomy. The second point is regarding the stock market, stockholder value maximization point. I was very brief in the presentation, but the point I want to raise is we are seeing the new financialization of platform economy is largely valuation driven. And that's partly because they are highly dependent on financial capital. When we are seeing what happened in the 1970s, deindustrialization was accompanied by financialization. We are probably seeing similar things today with financial capital with an upper hand determining the direction of platform economy by expanding on, burning caches rather than creating productive forces. And that's something I think we should be cautious about. And to some extent, this creates new vulnerabilities of the platform economy, makes them even more vulnerable when the interest rates are going up and adding more financial risks. I'll just stop here. I can't really hear clearly about the last two comments, but I'll probably watch YouTube recordings later. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Thank you so much.
We have Antonio.
Yes, I'll be very brief, and thanks so much for all the comments and points raised. Partially, what I was going to say has been addressed with the last two comments. So thanks, Antonello and Grazia. I think we need to be aware of the fact that this is an issue that is evolving, and the risk of over-imposing analytical categories. I think we are all coming from the same kind of intellectual, epistemological, but the risk can increase on us in terms of understanding the possibility that exists in very specific context. So my emphasis on, and if you see the paper, there's quite a lot on platform heterogeneity. It's not simply an analytical point, it's a policy point as well, because there is lots of interface that is still very tangible. I mean, all literature intangible, it's for me sometimes too intangible. There's lots of tangible in the intangible world, including, you know, as we know, everything that is about data storage, how it is used, how it is governed in many ways. There is a very important literature which try to frame now this interface, talking about ecosystem, digital ecosystem, where the value chain, the local and the global intersect. And to the extent that that intersection is still there, we still have the capacity of governments at different levels to exercise shaping powers or constraining powers or enabling powers, depending on what you're trying to achieve in the market. I also, in the same way, I would be concerned about using a, this is a play for pragmatism in this space, because lots of the things we are observing are evolving while we speak, right? And this is exactly what the competition authority are doing. They're saying, because we don't know how you're going to play the game, we don't want to regulate ex ante and lock ourselves into specific type of frameworks. We want to keep open the space for us to assess the extent to which you are going to abuse your power in different ways by shaping these multiple-sided market in different way. So in the same way, I think we should think about how policies have to be experimental in a sense and go very drill down in specific areas to see how we can actually change things that are, I think, suggested across the board. Last point, the easy, quick win would be to say, oh, well, how we try to find a way to socialize all this and getting, you know, the mentioned the digital infrastructure and so on. We also know, if you are at the moment in India, you would be probably happier to have the data controlled by Google than controlled by Modi, right? So let's be careful about not
socialize, not national.
Yes, but you know, so then we need to have an organizational form, right? So socialize, there is no organizational form, it's just a pure idealistic concept, which I'm buying completely into it, but it's not very helpful here in India. Just to say that it was not my chance. Yeah, no, I'm saying, I'm just to use the full spectrum of issues. Thank you.
Shall we ask you, Sandrine, would you like to say something?
Yeah, just a few things, not too long. So taking on thank you for the comments, which are very, very interesting. Sure, this is a sector that is changing, evolving constantly with interacting, interdependent, how do you say, other trends which are okay. We are digitalizing, but there is also the sustainability issue, the green transition, besides the digital transition and the demographic transition. So we have to be careful in defining these very rigid concepts and so on. Okay. So just a few points. Big data infrastructure as global public goods. That's also Antonio mentioned. Yeah, that's very good idea, and perhaps the Gaia X project in Europe is goes in this sense, because it's an association of the companies putting together all the big data of European people in that area, so that it is it avoids avoiding it being in the hands of just one or few private companies, right? Regarding the trade-off between industrial policy and competition policy, well, I don't remember what was the rest of the point, but what I wanted to say, I've put a note on it. First, I'm not sure there is a trade-off. you can do a competition policy, favor competition, while also having industrial policy for favoring certain developments, orientating industrial development towards some directions. And this so the European approach that we have stressed in our paper, first is dynamic, okay, ex ante approach, not imposing strict norms on the behavior, but a margin in which the behavior of firms should evolve so that it is fair and towards fairness and contestability. So this coupled with perhaps industrial strategy aiming at developing European champions could be a good idea. There is, I think, some project measures taken to favor that, but it could be much stronger in Europe, this policy to favor the development of European champions also. Okay, I stop there.
Thank you very much, David.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. Andrea, your point about financial services in the UK, there's been job losses in financial services in the UK post-Brexit, but not nearly as many as anticipated. But there's been very big growth in financial job services in Amsterdam, Milan, Paris, Dublin, where various bits of the value chain have gone off from London. So there's this talk now about missing jobs in financial services in the UK. Christoph, you make a really interesting point. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think there was an element of trying to do something against the orthodoxy, and that's partly why there was such a reaction. But I think there's another lesson as well, in that she was trying to do what Ronald Reagan had done in terms of unfunded tax cuts. The UK is not the US. There is not the seigniorage effect in the UK, and so markets put a price. I still think there is scope to say, right, we have a plan for net zero. We've got an industrial policy that requires very significant state investment. And I think the market would be willing to finance that, but it's making the case rather than just tax up for the sake of it. Final point on who's benefited from Brexit. Well, those that made bets on sterling in a big way. I think the right wing wanted a very extensive deregulation to become more like a US style economy, but that's been difficult. One of the interesting things is a kind of coalition of protest vote, those people who were always right wing anti-Europe, and left behind places who voted for Brexit as a protest vote. Now, ironically, Brexit has hurt them even more because of a lot of European funding. One group that may have potentially benefited is unskilled workers, because far fewer unskilled workers are now coming in. It's a sort of points-based system. There is actually quite a liberal migration policy, but unskilled workers don't face the competition of immigrants coming in. So maybe they've benefited, but the increase in the jobs and the increases in wages they've seen have sadly been overtaken by inflation. So who gains is a very good question.
Okay, well, we're finished. So Dario, you want to say something?
No, I think that we are just going towards the concluding part of the day, which is again in the end of Phil and Chris. And I think will tell us about how the wonderful day that we had, the 3 panels and the discussion links with the legacy of Keith Colling. And if you would like to come here and if you wish to come.
Oh, well, I will go then.
I'm going to have a round of applause for last second.
You have a presentation, right?
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
So
Which is?
that one tribute. Should we take 5 minutes break or just so people can stretch their legs a bit? 'Cause you've been sitting for 2 hours or
Not a good idea.
you don't think so?
No, 5 minutes is never 5 minutes. It's usually.
Well, does everybody want to stand up, and stretch or something? I don't. Okay, we'll go. Well, this shouldn't take too long. Okay, thank you. So again, thank you to the organizer. Thank you to Dario, Alina and Co who've organised this workshop today. I think it's been a very invigorating workshop. Really enjoyed it. Some really good sessions. I just want to spend the next 10-15 minutes or so providing some reflections on Professor Keith Cowan, who's this workshop's in honour of Keith Cowan and in honour of the special issue that we put together. I think we all agree it's had a really great collection of papers in there. So Keith Cowan passed away almost 7 years ago now, just a few weeks short of what would have been his 80th birthday. And this is a photo I grabbed, a screen grab off the internet. It's not one where he's actually got one of his Clint Eastwood stares, as Christoph would describe. It's a quite nice picture of him. There's the original Monopoly Capitalism book, which was published in 1982. It's kind of got an Andy Warhol type of theme in a sense. Keith kind of liked his pop art, and he liked some aspects of American culture because he did spend some time in the United States as a PhD student. The cover is actually chosen by his daughter Lucy, I think, in around 1980, 81. So just a little bit about Keith's life and background. He was born in Scunthorpe, which is in Yorkshire, in the north of England, and so a working class family. His father was a railway worker. He went to the local grammar school. He was a keen footballer. He loved football all his life. He started off studying agricultural sciences at Y College in Kent, which is part of the University of London. And in particular, he was interested in agricultural economics. It's where he got an interest in economics. And in the late 1950s, he got a scholarship to go over to the States, do a PhD at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And there he fell in love with American jazz and US baseball. And I think he shared a room with Zivy Grillfridge, who was a big innovation scholar who passed away 20 odd years ago. He really enjoyed his time in the States. He told me many stories of the things he got up to in the States and all the friends he had over there. He made many friends who became really established leaders in the field of economics. He came back from the States back in the mid-1960s, early 60s, and took a lectureship at the University of Manchester, and then was promoted to senior lecturer. And here he met his wife Barbara. So Keith was very much interested in empirical work. His early work was in agricultural economics, and in those days, the university only had sort of one mainframe computer, as you can imagine, back in the early 60s. And Barbara was one of these research assistants. She hadn't got a degree at that stage. She just basically researchers would come down every day on a daily basis, bring in their data, and she just input the data into the machine and give them the results the following day. It would take obviously about 24 hours to just run a basic regression in those days. And that's when he met Barbara, and they often go for coffee and began their courtship and got married, I think, in 1966. And it was then that Keith then moved to the new University of Warwick to take up a readership, a promotion, and eventually, after 4 years, at a relatively young age of 33, became a chair in industrial economics at Warwick. in the relatively small department of economics at the time. It was a change of field for him as well. He's after Warwick, he realised the funding for agricultural economics was falling, and he was more interested in industrial economics, and that's where he switched his interests and he took advantage of that opportunity. Very much involved in Warwick, French Warwick person. A growing, emerging department in the 1970s. He became head of the economics department. This was a time at Warwick when you got some really interesting people going there. Bob Stolo visited in the late 1960s, which became a lifelong friend of Keith's. Other prominent names, name in the paper who were there. The Nobel Prize winner was there from Masters. Who his name escapes me at the moment, but he was there in the early 70s, and they were particularly strong in industrial economics. Keith was doing that and very keen on bringing some key people into the department. People like Ken Wallace, he brought in, famous econometrician. Mike Waterson was a PhD student there under Keith. Steve Davis, who's got a piece in the special issue, was studied there and was at Warwick. Sadly, Steve Davis passed away as the special issue was about to come out late last year. So Keith was vibrant as head of economics. He was bringing in big names, Robert Skidelsky and people like that to Warwick. He always was sure that, for promotion, he wasn't always popular here, but he was very keen that Warwick kept a reputation that it'd be top for promotion, so he could become a credible, high-ranking economics department. He wasn't always popular with the staff there at the time, but he was strictly as good as that people going for promotion, but have to go through a very rigorous process, and the same for external appointments as well. But he would do his best to get the best people, irrespective of their political views or approach. He wanted the best people to come to Warwick. He was a university man as well as a department man. He'd been on the Senate at the university for a long time, so he very much valued university citizenship. And so much so, I mean, back in the 70s, they named a room after him, the Cowling Room, in the social science department and social science faculty, sorry. And it's still there today. You can go into Warwick and you'll go into the Cowling Room. It's still there, named after him. So he was very much regarded. And on his retirement in 2003, Mike Waterson, who by now returned to Warwick, put together a fest trip for him, an edited volume, and several of us in this room contributed. I think Malcolm, you had a chapter in there. I was fortunate; I've only just come out of my PhD. I was invited to contribute a chapter, and Christoph contributed a chapter, and we had a nice dinner at the university, celebrating Keith's contribution to Warwick. I mean, that he was in '67 then. So, and Michael Shattuck, who was not an academic, he was a university registrar, wrote a nice chapter about Keith's contribution to the university. And I think that quote I just called out there about him being a university citizen and his contribution to the university is pretty apt. He embraced life in Coventry. He was not a Coventry man when he came there, but he embraced life in Coventry. He started to follow the local football team and would be a season ticket holder at Coventry City, and he followed their trials and tribulations. During his time at Warwick, they were always in the top division and never relegated. Even for a small provincial club, and they even won the FA Cup in 1987. When he retired, they just dropped down the divisions to the bottom division. I don't know what he would have made about that. He'd have been appalled, but they're back on the verge of the Premiership again, unbelievably. So they've got a playoff final. They could be back in the Premiership next season. So, he loved his football. He loved playing five-a-side. He would get to play five-a-side football at the department until he was about into his 50s. In 60s, I think Christoph remembers plenty of games at five-a-side in the department. And they were quite lively events, I remember. So he was big into local jazz scene. And he loved promoting local musicians. So Coventry had a very strong music scene in the late 1970s and 1980s, a very interesting music scene known as Tuto. So bands you may have heard of, like the Selector and the Specials, and bands that came out of Coventry at the time, a mix of black and white musicians who tried to cut across racial barriers and were very successful. Keith was instrumental in some of those, giving them their first gigs in the city. He loved his walking. He loved walking and occasional running. After the 1987 general election, I believe I've been told he was so disillusioned Margaret Thatcher's third victory in that election that he helped to establish a left boot club, which would walk around Coventry, and they knew their rights in about walking across agricultural land up to some annoyance of local farmers. So he was very much into the local scene. A lot of people talk about that he's very proud of Coventry, even though a lot of people. One of the sayings in England is that if you're being ignored, you've been sent to Coventry. It's got that. Coventry has that kind of reputation where you don't want to speak to somebody, you're sending them to Coventry. But he was very proud of living in Coventry, and yes, and I do know one story where on an undergraduate open day, prospective open day for prospective students, one prospective student put their hand up and said, "Well, what's it like living in Coventry? I've heard it's a right dump, And Keith turned around and gave him one of his Clint Eastwood stare and said, "I live here." I think that put him in, put the student in his place. So, but obviously we talked a lot about his scholarly contribution, quite rightly so today. And we tried to summarize it. You can't summarize it in 10,000 words in the introduction to the special issue, but I think we try to do it in an entertaining way and in an informative way. We talked a lot about these things today, about his contribution to industrial economics, his work in advertising, price cost margins, entry barriers, all these neoclassical tools to look at these issues and raise significant concerns for the public interest. It's always the public interest that drove his research and drove his interest in the research he was doing. So the later work he did on the modern corporation and the theory of the firm, which got me so interested in his work as well. And at this time, of course, he was the founding president of the European Association for Research in Industrial Economics in the 1970s, which is still going today, a very prominent, largely mainstream. I have to admit, I last went about 10 years ago, and I did find it a little bit laborious. And Keith said, "Well, that's why I stopped going, because all you saw was PhD students writing out long mathematical equations, which have a beauty, I'm sure. But I thought, well, there's only so much you can sort of twist the hoteling model every now and again." But he was the founding member of that, early president. He set up the International Journal of Industrial Organization. There was an early editor of that in the 1980s, and some really interesting stuff was published there early on. I think the origins of the strategic decision-making approach can be seen in a nice paper which Christoph put in there with Roger Sutton in 1986. A really interesting paper there, which helped shape Keith's work on strategic decision-making. And of course, back into the 90s, he was a founder of the European Network for Industrial Policy. That always drove him, and that was very successful in the 1990s and early 2000s. And still, members of that community are still very much in touch, and that's some of the reason why I'm in touch with some of you guys here and I know some of you guys today. So I'm very grateful for that organization, which was founded with European money, European EU money. Radical political economy. He was a radical political economist, and I think Malcolm once edited a book on the voices or the voices of dissenting economists. So Keith has got a short biography in there. He did quite a lot of work on monopoly capitalism, transnational capitalism, and beyond capitalism in the 1980s with Roger. He said to me there were two books, I think, which influenced his thinking. The first one was reading Barron and Sweezy in the 1970s. he said until then, he just thought of this, in a very mainstream way. Yes, there are problems with markets, there's problems with market structures. Here are the sort of solutions we need to look at. But Byron and Weezy gave him a more of a macro perspective, and he was able to expand on that and deal with it in a conceptual framework, bringing some neoclassical tools in there to give it a right a bit more rigor. But he really enjoyed that book, and that was an influential book for him. The second book that was really influenced him was by Farr and Sable, by the sociologist Farr and Sable in the 1980s, The Second Industrial Divide, when he was talking about the stagnation of the 70s, the crisis of capitalism in the 70s and 80s, and looked at alternative modes of production, and in particular looked at possibilities for the growth of industrial districts, and particularly Italian districts, which seem to offer the so-called Emilian model, seem to offer a more diffuse mode of governance and a more prosperous way forward. So those two books were really the key influential books that influenced his thinking during his career, and obviously that led, to a lot of his work on industrial policy. So his early work on industrial policy was like focusing on advertising and how we might deal with advertising and mergers. And there's a book there on merger and economics in the late 70s with other colleagues from work there with the writers looking on strategic trade policy, and then a lot more on looking forward. He always wanted to look forward. Policy from the 21st century. We have a number of articles there, contributions of myself and David Bailey as well, and others. And of course, he was a policy advisor. In the 1980s, he was a policy advisor to the Labour Party when he was in opposition, and helped support Labour friends of industry and looking for certain ways forward. He advised on regional bodies and so forth, and often sat on select committees at the Houses of Parliament and advised at the EU level on occasion. So he did all this. He contributed with his academic scholarly contribution, but also his he was always interested in the practice as well, and how that could be applied in the real world. So I think as Sandrine said, I was fortunate. Through the unit network, I got to meet Sandrine, I got to know Patricio Bianchi. I came across Patricio 25 years ago this year with the Ferrara Summer School. Again, something that came out of Europe, unit, sorry. And I was fortunate to be invited to co-edit this book on industrial development, which is a fantastic book. There's some really great authors in there, looking at a range of issues to do with industrial development and policy. And we did decide to dedicate the book to Keith, because for some people he was a colleague, for others a mentor, for others a friend, and for others an inspiration. For me, he was all four. So that was true for several others in the room today. But that was nice to do that. Thanks for listening, and thanks for the day. If you've got a reflection and comments or memories of Keith that you want to share them with us, please do. The floor is yours. And then if you want to add anything, Christos, or
I have to say two things which might have been underemphasized. The one is that Keith had the largest number probably of supervisees in the country, or at least one of the largest, and many of these people became top of the top either in mainstream economics like Mike Watterson and Paul Jarosky, or in non-mainstream economics. But it does show the importance of creating an ecosystem. In this sense, if the sort of sign of success of a person, of an academic, is to create students that they are better than him, probably at the individual level, probably Keith failed because nobody surpassed him. But at the collective level, he certainly succeeded because the ecosystem value co-creation out of the system of students that he created, I believe, surpassed even his own contribution. Let me say that these were around 30 students, so I hope I'm not undermining what he said. The second thing is to say how uncompromising Keith was. There is a reason that I mentioned Peter here. Phil mentioned how sometimes he might become unpopular. Keith never played the game, and that could really be actually, he was uncompromising with moral issues. I wish the deontology that we taught from him, and sometimes I wish I never learned it. Because I still feel like I have to as Edith Penrose told me once, why do you need to cite every Dick and Harry in everything you are writing? And basically, this is something I got out of Keith. That is, if you read something and it's relevant to what you say, you have to cite it, whether it's a working paper or an elite publication, as opposed to what is now the game, that is, cite only the other Nobel Prize winners and ignore the fact that everything you say, as Antonello quite properly said, it's been said so many times before by top people, and you just ignore them and you present it as if these people don't exist. I mean, that sometimes could make him less popular than one might. I have a personal story that I did not share in the introduction. One of his students was one of the top people who went to Australia, Steve Dowdy, in actually using computers when at the time they looked alien to the likes of me. And on one occasion, I'm not even sure I should be revealing this, he actually broke into Keith's files and found the reference to letter that Keith was sending to universities about me getting a job. And Keith's reference letter was one sentence, and he said, this guy will change the nature of economics as we know it. Of course, he was absolutely wrong. And because he was so disappointed about this, I found out when I was looking for promotion at Cambridge that one of the people told me, change this referee because the referee is not good. Everybody's choosing referees who say this guy is the best thing since sliced bread. And this guy says that both your advantages and your disadvantages, and in particular that you failed to realize his expectation. I did not change him, and I still got my promotion in the end, but what I'm saying, that was key. He would say things as they were. Some people would not like this, but if you knew where it was coming from, that is uncompromising moral and deontological approach, you would appreciate it and not feel cross about it. That's all I want to say. Sorry, I took a bit too long. Thank you very much.
I think that uncompromising nature even extended to his own son Mark, who was a professor of entrepreneurship at Oxford Brookes. So I was speaking to Mark, just to share this with you briefly, speaking to Mark, once he said, well, he gave a seminar at Warwick, and Warwick can be a bit of an uncompromising phrase when you give a seminar because the questions are coming at you, trying to shoot you down. And he said, well, everybody was really nice, all the economic professors were really nice. And my dad was sitting there in the front row, and he asked the first question, or made the first comment, and Mark did entrepreneurship, and he said, I would have started my analysis while you finished yours. Which showed, in a sense, how he kind of always reached for the bigger picture. Thank you.
Okay, so I think what remains is just to thank you all, to thank you. Let me just stop sharing here so we can also see Jean-Gilles. So thank you very much. I think this has not been just inspiring, now also emotional. So thank also for gifting us this final very, very emotional moment. And I think it is also always crucial, and we remember in moments like this to have clear where the roots are and why we discuss some things in some ways and share our way to approach things, even if heterogeneously, because there are some roots and because things evolve but remain inside us. So thank you very much to you all for coming, for attending, for the PhD students participating to the course, for those coming to the workshop today, to Yelena, Valerio, Nicolò, and Vicente for giving a tremendous support to enlighten them. Yeah, and
Thank for organizing it.
No. Thank you all. Thank you to all the speakers, and let's hope to have in the next future, I don't know, here in the UK or whatever else, moments of this kind, since the network is here and we wish to consolidate it. And so, thank you again, and thank you, Zanjin, and see you soon.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye-bye. Ciao. It has been a wonderful day, and
Thank you, and let's talk about
especially
this issue about intellectual